In the early 1800s, Greenwich Village was essentially a suburb of New York City, which was then confined to the lower tip of Manhattan. The first New York orphan asylum was a wood frame house at 16 Raisin Street. However, Raisin Street was actually officially called Reason Street, named for Thomas Paine's work, The Age of Reason. Paine was a resident of the village when he died in 1809, mostly penniless, in a home on Grove Street. After his death, a new lane was built behind the house and was named for him in tribute. However, his work and ideas were largely unpopular at the time, and the honorific tribute was soon popularly bastardized to Raisin. The Age of Reason advocated against Christianity, so even though the street's nomenclature no longer directly referenced Paine, in 1829 the Trinity Church advocated for a new name. They suggested Barrow Street for Thomas Barrow, who had made a popular engraving of Trinity Church when it burned down in 1776. The second home of the New York Orphan Asylum was on what is today West 4th Street, between West 12th, which was formerly Troy Street, and Bank Street. Due to the prominence of the orphanage, West 4th was known as Asylum Street at that time. After the society made the move uptown, the asylum building was demolished and the street name was changed, partially to escape the stigma that such a name held. When New York City adopted the grid street pattern as per the Commissioner's Plan of 1811, the west side of Greenwich Village was allowed to maintain its unique streets. But at the time that the New York Orphan Asylum was in the village, its westernmost border was Greenwich Street, which ran along the Hudson River. Everything west of Greenwich has since been built on landfill. To continue confusing all of us with name changes, at that time the Hudson was called the North River, translation of the Dutch Newt River, but it had also been known as the Great Mohegan by the Iroquois, and Mukhankiantuk, the river that flows two ways, by the Lenape, and the Rio San Antonio by explorers from Spain. Greenwich Village was very different at that time. From 1797 until 1829, it was home of New York's first state penitentiary, Newgate Prison, which was often over capacity by twice its limit. Overcrowding was handled by the steady release of prisoners, up to 50 per day. Yet much of the village at that time was still a hamlet of farms and suburban block homes. One reason that the prison was located in the village was the reform movement, the same one that later moved the orphanage uptown for the health benefits of the children. Additionally, though, Greenwich Village was home to a potter's field in Washington Square. As you can see, this was an ideal neighborhood for children. However, the area occupied by the villages from river to river, north of Houston Street, was also home to some of New York City's wealthy elite, who sought reprieve from the bustle and disease of the city. Between 1815 and 1830, Greenwich Village was transformed from a suburb to a busy part of New York City. Urban development at that time was largely influenced by disease, and people who could afford it moved ever northward, seeking open spaces away from the diseased masses. This pattern marked the development of New York City, but also of the orphan asylum. When the city was at its doors, the asylum moved north from Greenwich Village to its Bloomingdale location. Years later, when the wealthy people that surrounded its new location began to complain about the asylum, charging its wards were undesirable, it moved north again. Looking at the Greenwich Village neighborhood today, it's difficult to imagine such a divergent socioeconomic context. But the neighborhood wasn't the only thing that was different at the time. Children, and in particular charity work, was thought of on entirely different terms. 19th century New Yorkers had a penchant for founding special interest societies in the service of children. In New York, this meant a proliferation of orphan care facilities, each devoted to a specific group of people, including the Hebrew Orphan Asylum of New York, the Guardian Angel Home for Little Children, the Roman Catholic Orphan Society, the Colored Orphan Asylum, St. Joseph's Asylum, and the tragically named Home for the Friendless, which looked after children under age 11, whose mission was to protect, befriend, and train to virtue and usefulness those whom no one seemed to have thought. Like the New York Orphan Asylum, the Home for the Friendless referred to orphan children as inmates, but also often enough as family. If this seems like a lot of orphans, it was. Epidemics such as the 1832 cholera outbreak flooded the city with orphans. Organizations such as the Hebrew Orphan Asylum were so overwhelmed with children that they restricted entry only to Manhattan, which led to the creation of the Brooklyn Hebrew Orphan Asylum Society. But epidemics caused by public health problems, such as overcrowding and poor sanitation, weren't the only reason the orphan homes were so crowded. The New York Orphan Asylum Society and organizations like it had varying definitions of orphan, and many looked after children when only one parent had died or abandoned the family, and the other was forced to work. Sometimes orphan organizations took on these half-orphans for a fee and were the forebears of modern daycare. Originally, the New York Orphan Asylum had strict rules about only accepting true orphans, but these changed over time. The Society's board was made entirely of women, from its founding until 1958. This practice was not necessarily standard for the time. While it was common for women to be the majority supporters of children's aid organizations, others, such as the Society for the Relief of Half-Orphans and Destitute Children, founded in 1835, which New York Orphan Asylum later merged with, were run by male directors. There was also an elected advisory committee of gentlemen to take charge of the property and funds of the society, subject to approval of the board. The object of the society upon its founding was to provide an asylum for the care, support, and education of orphans and other such destitute children as shall be considered suitable recipients of its benefits. Orphans will be clothed, fed, and educated in the asylum at the expense of the society and trained in habits of neatness, industry, and good order. As soon as the age and acquirements of the children shall render them capable of earning their living, they shall be apprenticed only to responsible persons, and in such a manner as the Board of Trustees shall approve. So you can see from an early point that the expectations for the children were that they would learn to be respectable young people, but of the working class. Focus was always on ensuring that the wards would eventually be self-reliant individuals. Vocational training, such as was employed at the New York Orphan Asylum Society, is an example of a practice that continued to dominate child care industries throughout much of their history. Other practices pioneered by the Orphan Asylum Society, which still impact child care today, include the introduction of coeducational schooling, outdoor education, and youth leadership in governance. The New York Orphan Asylum Society also pioneered the use of scholarships so that its wards could pursue higher education, and was one of the first child care organizations to employ group homes, a practice which is still used today. Inside the history of the New York Orphan Asylum Society are many stories. Some of these stories are tragic, speaking to the exploitation and abandonment of the most vulnerable people, children. But others are hopeful, the kindness of those who would look after them, or in cases where that kindness was lacking, the strength of the children to overcome adversity. In conclusion, we'd like to leave you with a brief story, in hopes that it allows you to reflect on the past of the Orphan Asylum Society, as well as the future that we all share.